are not a person, you have a person.
I had planned another closing message, but I feel compelled to say what I'm about to say. Now, I risk sounding like a conspiracy theorist, but it's no longer a theory. What I'm about to say is fact. The secret organizations of the world power elite are no longer secret. They have planned and are now leading us into a one-world communist government.
The world they're bringing in is to be a world where everyone who is born, or would be allowed to be born, would be born to serve the state.
They seek to establish systems of government based on the regimentation of all human beings by a handful of individual rulers who seize power by force. Yes, these men and their hypnotized followers call this a new order. It is not new, and it is not order.
Collectivism is that concept where individuals are considered to be discardable, and that the group is more important, and that the state is the all-important unit of society, and citizens exist only to serve the state.
What if I told you the government has your baby's DNA, and in some states, that DNA is stored even without your consent?
You cannot expect to have a smoothly running world socialist system if you have people out there who are going to object.
These 3 words is how the government has been getting authority over us. Registration, application, submission, all of the power they have over you is because you have put your signature on a document with 1 or 2 or 3 of these words.
I was born free. And I'm free because I say I am, and not because the government give me a piece of paper.
But these are my sons. They don't belong to the state.
We have to maintain the confidence in the system because it's a voluntary system of payment of our taxes.
Agreed. So the government will issue a driver's license, giving us permission. How does the government give us permission? We have rights. We give the government permission.
Hi, this is Steve Bates. I began researching the Truth Movement back in 2008, and even back then, I had the foresight to see that within this movement, there are those who, either knowingly or unknowingly, tend to overcomplicate things. And then there are those like myself who follow the KISS rule. Keep it simple, stupid. Having understood this concept, I naturally gravitated towards researchers and presenters who could explain things in very simple terms. This instinct allowed me to avoid all of those highly entertaining, yet intentionally diversionary conspiracy theories, and maintain my undivided focus on just one thing: how the world really works. This film is the culmination of my 6 years of deep research, and in keeping with the KISS rule, it will explain how the world really works simply by placing everything into just 2 categories: the 2 opposing ideological systems that are currently running simultaneously, side by side, and they are collectivism and individualism.
In 1910, the Carnegie trustees asked themselves this question, quote, "Is there any way known to man more effective than war to so alter the life of an entire people?" End quote. For a year, the trustees sought an effective, peaceful method to alter the life of an entire people. But ultimately, they concluded that war was the most effective way to change people. Oh, God. World War I. Horrible war. Consequently, the trustees of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace next asked themselves, quote, how do we involve the United States in a war? And they answered, quote, we must control the diplomatic machinery of the United States by first gaining control of the State Department. Now, don't forget, this is 1910. Norm Dodd said that the trustees' minutes reinforced what the Reese Committee had uncovered elsewhere about the Carnegie Endowment, that it had already become a powerful policy-making force inside the State Department. During those early years of the Carnegie Endowment, war clouds were already forming over Europe, and the opportunity for the enactment of their plan was drawing near. History proved that World War I did indeed have an enormous impact on the American people. For the first time in our history, large numbers of wives and mothers had to leave the home to work in war factories, thus effectively eroding women's historic role as the heart of the family. The sanctity of the family itself was placed in jeopardy. Life in America was so thoroughly changed that, according to Norman Dodd, quote, the trustees had the brashness to congratulate themselves on the wisdom and validity of their original decision, end quote. They sent a confidential message to President Wilson, horrible, listen to this, insisting that the war not be ended too quickly. Carnegie trustee Cleveland Dodge, one of Wilson's financial supporters, had direct access to the president. After the war, the Carnegie Endowment trustees reasoned that if they could get control, here we go, of education in the United States, they would be able to prevent a return to the way of life as it had been prior to the war. And they recruited the Rockefeller Foundation to assist in such a monumental task. According to Dodd, quote, they divided the task in parts, giving to the Rockefeller Foundation the responsibility of altering education as it pertains to domestic subjects. That was the Southern Education Board they set up. But Carnegie retained the task of altering our education in foreign affairs and about international relations. That would be UNESCO, UN, all that stuff. The foundations decided that the most effective method of achieving this goal would be to alter American history. So they awarded grants, fellowships, and scholarships to those professors and historians who would rewrite American history and promote one worldism, humanism, and socialism. By the early 30s, the well-laid plans of the foundation trustees had reached fruition, and a Reese Committee staff report concluded, 1, that there had indeed been a non-bloody revolution in America between 1933 and 1936. 2, that a certain few foundations had funded efforts to change the beliefs of the American people through education and propaganda. And 3, that these revolutionary changes had been accepted without resistance. To demonstrate how thoroughly American opinion had been changed according to the plan of the foundations, we cite the following historical example. At the end of World War I, Woodrow Wilson and his shadowy alter ego, Colonel Edward M. House, tried to sell the U.S. Senate and the American people on the idea of the League of Nations. This was, of course, the first concerted international effort towards a one-world government. Wilson and House failed in their mission, but a generation later, after another great war and much re-education via college international relations clubs, international studies, educational grants, and the like, the Senate and the people readily accepted membership in the United Nations.
If you look at how politics is run, and you go into the writings of people like Lenin, for instance, Lenin said there are 1,000 directions and systems in which people could go and live under, but the public mustn't know that. He said it's important that the system that's created for them is accepted by the people so that they think that it's the only system that could possibly work.
Most of us, including myself for certain, in my younger years, I was brought up thinking that you had to choose, if you were smart at least, you would have to choose politically between being on the right or the left. You had to have a political view, And I thought that in those days, I thought that the extreme right would be something like fascism or Nazism. And on the extreme left, of course, you would have communism or socialism, just a little bit short of that. So that was the paradigm that I was taught, and it seemed to make sense at the time.
And it's true. We're contained in a system of left and rights, supposedly the have-nots against the haves, or those who own the means of production against those who don't, the workers. And that's traditional Labour versus Tory or Conservative versus Democrat. That's how the system is run. It keeps the public contained within a system of thinking that it must be one or the other, or a middle road in between, which they push. It never occurs to the general public that society has lived in the past under many different types of systems. And as Lenin said, it's important the public don't know that the system they're born into was designed for them, and that it could be any different. They must think it's the only natural one that could have evolved in their lifetime.
But as I became more involved in these issues and learned more about them, I began to realize that the basic philosophy between the so-called extreme left people, on communists and socialists, and the so-called philosophy on the right of the fascists and the Nazis was really the same. I said, how can this be? They're supposed to be opposites of each other. And then I began to realize that there is something more common to all of these philosophies that was left out of my training and education. And that was the ideology of collectivism. I began to realize that the thing that was common to them all is something called collectivism. Now that's a word that is not very well used. It's not very entrenched in the vocabulary of most people today. But I found out that it was a very commonly used word about a century ago. People wrote a lot about collectivism, and the opposite of that would be individualism. Those are two words that are sort of abandoned today, but in my view, I think they need to be recaptured and understood and used more.
The concept of individuality only came out in about the 1700s. Before that, everybody was either a somebody, that was nobility and royalty, and then you had a middle class of merchants and merchant bankers, a few free men, and then the rest were serfs or peasants. So everyone was lumped in as a mass of their own little clique, and sometimes a big clique like the peasants. And then again, too, ever since the Enlightenment, they went right back to trying to force you all back into the mass man. That's all that Marx talked about, the masses, the masses, the masses.
The whole ideology boils down to a choice between two things. One is individualism, and the other is collectivism. Those words have meaning. Individualism, simply in a general sense, means that the basis of society is the individual. That's the most important element in society. And the purpose of the state is to protect the individual. And the state is the servant of the people. That's individualism. Collectivism, it's the other way around. The collectivists believe that the state or the group is the most important element of society. And the purpose of the people is to serve the state.
The Royal Institute for International Affairs, which has branches in every country in the world, they set up the United Nations. They said in their own writings, from the earliest times to the present, the world they're bringing in is to be a world where everyone who is born, or would be allowed to be born, would be born to serve the state.
They want the idea of the individual and minorities being sacrificed for the greater good of the greater number, which they will define. They will tell you what the greater good for the greater number is, and we're supposed to be mentally defeated by that. Oh, well, if it's for the greater good of the greater number, we cannot object to it. And that's how the game is played. They intend to control us through our own minds, getting us to be willing to be slaves because it's for the greater good for the greater number, you see. So once you buy into that, there is no atrocity that cannot be committed for the greater good or the greater number.
I've been profoundly influenced by the work of Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises, who developed a whole philosophy and economic system based on the core ethic of non-aggression. Motivated by having witnessed the ravages of communism and fascism in Europe, he committed his life to finding a just way. He recognized that those systems, as well as socialism and even democracy, wrongly assume the rights of the collective, or the group, to be more important than those of the individual. I had always gone along with the view that more people will thrive if we consider the group's needs above the individual's. But when I took a closer look, I found it doesn't really work that way. In the name of what's best for the group, governments have been responsible for most of the war, death, and destruction on the planet. More than 200 million individuals were killed in the 20th century alone.
We're big on talking about how we can elect our leaders. But as Dick Gregory once said a long time ago, yes, we can elect our leaders, but you can't select your leaders. How many people have ever wondered, what does the word poll mean? Why do you have to go to the poll? It's like Gallup, the Gallup company, it's called the Gallup poll. Anytime some company is taking a poll, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that they are electing anybody. You take a poll to get a consensus of what the people are thinking. That's what a poll is. It's called a Gallup poll. There are many other companies that conduct polls for universities, for government. So that's what a poll is to get a consensus of what the people are thinking. How many people like this color or this product as opposed to how many like the Pepsi as opposed to Coca-Cola as opposed to root beer? And so they take a poll. And so the poll shows that the masses all particularly like one product. That's all they wanted to know. Just which one do you like best? It doesn't mean much of anything. It's just a poll. All 6 of them work for the company. They work for the government. Period. But which one do you particularly like? Because this way, if you particularly like one and you vote for him, then we will make him the president of the company, and you will be happy because it was your choice. No, it wasn't your choice. You didn't have the opportunity to select your leader. You only had the opportunity to elect one of the 6 that they gave you, and all 6 worked for the same company.
And they've even written about it. There's a fellow by the name of Carroll Quigley, who's a former history professor at Georgetown University. And he wrote several books about this group of people and their origins and their roots coming from Europe and England in particular. And he comes to a very interesting point in one of his books where he says, okay, this is the way the real world is. He said, how is it that we collectivists, we elitists, how can we rule the world when at the same time we want to let the average person think that they're living in a, quote, democracy. They're living in a system where their vote counts. They're living in this world in which they feel that they must participate in their own political destiny. This is a carefully nurtured myth that they want to create, so people will be content with no matter what happens to them, they'll say, well, I voted for it, or I did it. This government is my government. No matter how bad it is, it's responsible to me. And as long as people have that image, then they don't complain so much about how bad it gets because they did it, they think. So Quigley deals with this question, how do you let people think that they're directing their own political destiny when at the same time we, the elite, we are the ones who must direct their political destiny without them knowing it. How do you do that? And he answers the question brilliantly. He said, it's very simple. You've got to have 2 major political parties, and they'll both have the same major goals, the same basic fundamental principles, and they'll argue with each other on the surface with slogans and leadership and style and all of that sort of thing. He said, but we will control them both. There's the strategy. There's the whole scam behind this left-right paradigm. When you understand this history and this reality, you look at it and you say, well, yes, we've got a left wing and a right wing, but they're just opposite wings of the same ugly bird. And that bird is called collectivism.
You had better wake up and understand that you have left your government in the hands of other people to take care of things for you because you're too busy with your everyday life. Well, when you leave your personal business and your children and your life in the hands of someone else to take care of you, they're going to take care of you all right. Whatever decisions they make, they're going to take care of themselves, not you. Because you left yourself in their care, they will decide what you will eat. They will decide what you will wear. They will decide if you will have a job or not. Why? Well, because you left yourself in my care. I'm supposed to be in charge of you. So I will decide how much you will make. And you can bet that I'm going to make 1,000 times more than you do, because I'm in charge. After all, you voted for me.
Every country was basically signing the same laws, and had been my whole life, at the same time, that affected their societies. Laws were introduced and bills were introduced unbeknownst to the people in those countries that it was being introduced in their neighboring countries or even across the water somewhere at the same time. I realized there was already a governmental control, obviously, that coordinated all of this, and it led me into the United Nations. For every single department of government you have on a federal, local, county, state, provincial level, the United Nations had an equivalent department to deal with everything. It was already set up, in fact, to be global government. H.G. Wells said at the League of Nations, which was the embryo for the United Nations, he said, this is the nucleus of the world governments, when eventually all laws will come from there, be passed and signed into law by treaty of all the member countries. Eventually, we won't even have to go through the farce, and that's what it is, of voting in parties or candidates, because in the latter part of the 20th century and now into the 21st century, we're being trained, rather obviously, to simply accept rule by experts, rule by scientists, rule by professionals.
To them, I'm sure they look at it as a wonderful thing. They see it as an end of nationhood, as it has been historically defined. They see that as advantageous, they say, because it'll put an end to war and so forth. And they can sell the idea as a great step toward brotherhood and a unified globe and so forth. They use all of these things to make it sound good. But when you start examining the actual policies that they're instituting, it's not so hot.
We know, for instance, that communitarianism is a term used first by Bush Sr., talking about the collectivist society coming in. The United Nations has us all split up into communities. It's promoted through local TV. Even Sudbury here has your community. This is your local community. Be involved in your community. They're talking about a politically correct community. That's the problem. Government really penetrated and altered and distorted and changed society through communities. Not just with television, which certainly destroyed the community spirit. The intent of governments, this is how abusers work too. Abusers work with the same technique because they want power over a victim. The abuser will come in and take care initially of problems of the abused. Often the problems are the very outcome of what the abusers have been doing to the victims in the first place. Governments came in with welfare, for instance, a long time ago, in all countries about the same time. At one time, families helped each other out. You didn't need welfare. If someone lost their job, everyone chipped in. You didn't condemn the family member for being unemployed or ill or whatever, or losing their job. Families helped each other. Now, the family, remember, is still really the smallest nucleus of a tribe. And then government came in with unemployment insurance, which they took off you, but nothing was for free. And gradually over time, when people became unemployed or even sick for a while and couldn't work, I heard people even say to their own relatives, well, go to welfare, that's what they're for. There are social agencies to deal with this. Until today, we're in a sad state where even close relatives won't help each other out. They expect the government, the abuser, the government is the abuser. They expect the government to take care of all financial problems for the unfortunate victims. And they stop helping each other out. The family is no longer in the way when government comes for an individual. Each individual will be solely responsible to the government itself, and no family will stand up around them like a primitive tribe and defend them. Because the government's mandate is for control over the victims, not to help the victims. Those who fall under that particular level into the welfare state have their lives run by government agencies and social workers. That's what Huxley says. He says that they won't need their survival capabilities. Russell said the same thing, because the government is taking care and making all their decisions for them. In order to help you, it's really to take you over and have you obeying them and their system.
From the time we're very young, we're taught to, worship authority basically because that's our key to survival as young children. But as adults, we never go through the rites of passage that tell us how to methodically think for ourselves, and thus we're always in a state of extended adolescence.
Education should aim at destroying free will so that pupils are thus schooled they will be incapable throughout the rest of their lives of thinking or acting otherwise than as their schoolmasters would have wished. Influences of the home are obstructive, and in order to condition students, verses set to music and repeatedly intoned are very effective. It is for a future scientist to make these maxims precise and discover exactly how much it costs per head to make children believe that snow is black. When the technique has been perfected, every government that has been in charge of education for more than one generation will be able to control its subjects securely without the need of armies or policemen." End quote.
Young people cannot be trusted to form their own opinions. It's our job to tell them.
There was an organized effort in our schools today to indoctrinate our children in internationalism. In other words, belief in the United Nations and certainly to do the thought that we should do away with national sovereignty. There's an organized effort in our schools today to teach children about collectivism and the importance of socialism and reliance upon government to change our society. There's an organized effort within education to destroy the belief in absolutes in our children and to destroy a belief in God. The purpose of education in America today is not education. It is indoctrination in internationalism, in collectivism, and in atheism, and they're doing a wonderful job.
Some of them are so arrogant, like the Julian Huxley, who was the first CEO of UNESCO, who said that UNESCO's function, by the way, the United Nations Organization for Education worldwide, was to create a standardized system of education across the world so that all children could be manipulated into the same thought patterns, belief patterns, and mentality, basically. A standardization process, a Plato's cave that we'd all grow up in, never knowing anything outside that cave. He was quite blatant about that. It was for social engineering purposes, not for educational purposes as such.
In 1980, I went to work for Ronald Reagan, and I worked there for 2 years until I was fired. But I had worked hard for him from 1978 to get him elected, right? And then in 1980, because of the work I'd done and the work in education, they put me, I got an appointment in the U.S. Department of Education. Because the people in Washington, with the conservatives, they were good back then, they're not anymore. They were very impressed by the work I'd done in Maine on education, so they pulled me down and put me in the U.S. Department of Ed in what was the most important slot probably in the world in education. I know people out there are shaking their head and say, why would they put her there? She doesn't have a college education, right? Why are they putting her in there? Well, they knew, first of all, Reagan had promised to get rid of the Department of Education, something he didn't do, and I will hold that against him forever because he could have. Since that was the plan when they were staffing the department, they didn't have to put important people in those old slots. Like my slot that I got put into would have been filled by the former president of Harvard or Stanford or something, right? Or University of Chicago. That job had been held in the past by very important people in education. But since they were getting rid of the department, it didn't make any difference. So they just plopped me in. Now talk about the hand of God, huh? And all my files were full of everything they planned on doing. And so I don't even think my boss knew this. You know, he was a so-called conservative. But he became very suspicious about me because I was always busy. Even though I didn't have a lot of work to do from him, I was always busy because I had lots of things to read. And I would stay after work. I'd stay until 2 a.m. in the morning. When everybody was gone, I'd get into everything. Sure, if it had just been the job and all the files and everything had been whisked away by these former very important educational change agent communists, Marxists, I would not have found stuff, but all the stuff was left in the office. What I saw was so depressing. That's hardly the word. I mean, this was the education of Charlotte. It was the greatest horror story I had ever encountered. And at one point, he sent me, he wanted to get rid of me out of that office. He sent me up to the National Institute of Education, which is where all the research is performed. They send out all the grants and contracts to the universities or schools or whatever from there. I found out I was really in the belly of the beast right there, because I had access to all the computer printouts of all the grants and contracts of your money folks going out, not just across our country, but all around the world, about how to change the education system from academics to a brainwashing using Pavlovian, Skinnerian, operant conditioning computers and workforce training for the globalist economy, the corporate fascist socialist communist government that's coming right in this minute.
Now look at this news article from Infowars.com. School test teaches kids commands of government officials must be obeyed by all. This is a 10-year-old's English test. But what's even worse is the question that follows it. The wants of an individual are less important than the well-being of the nation. This, my friends, is collectivism being taught to 10-year-olds.
Now, if I could ask you, when you were in the Department of Education, what was the biggest piece of evidence you found proving everything that you're talking about now?
Well, the White House Private Sector Initiative, I went over there and I said, what are you doing? It looks like you're merging the public and private sector. And I said, isn't that corporate fascism? And they said, I don't think anybody looks at it that way. Well, that was it. Yeah. That was, under Reagan, the system broke. That was Cap Weinberger, Mad Meese. Together, they decided to change America. The same thing Carnegie Corporation called for in 1934.
What is the true agenda of these elites and people like the Carnegie families and the Rockefeller families?
Right from the beginning. Yeah. They have really, well, you can go all the way back to the 1700s, you know, with Adam Weishaupt and the Illuminati, and then Karl Marx in 1848 with copied Weishaupt's work. And then you go to the order at Yale, too. I have the document out of Phi Delta Kappa, how they would change education to performance-based. Now, they couldn't get away with that with the white community, but they knew they could use the minorities, so they did. And they started that with mastery learning in Chicago, and half of the inner city kids in the freshman class dropped out. Yeah. And even Education Week said, which is a professional journal, they called it a human tragedy of enormous proportions. But that didn't stop them from using this non-competitive individual education plan, Skinnerian, dumbed-down curriculum, because they had to perfect it over a period of 30 years with the minorities in order to move it to all of us, which is what they're putting in all the schools now.
But even under the new Common Core, even if they said 3 times 4 was 11, if they were able to explain their reasoning and explain how they came up with their answer really in words and in oral explanations, and they showed it in the picture, but they just got the final number wrong, we're really more focusing on the how.
The kids start looking at the state as the family, as the school, as the officials, as their family, not as the parents teaching them.
It's removing the Carnegie unit, which requires the old Carnegie unit. You guys went through it in school. You know, we all did. 4 years of math, 4 science, 4 English, 4 history, whatever, in order to graduate. And all of that has been removed now because the student is not focusing on intellectual endeavor. It's workforce training. And so they're taking those years away, and they're taking ABCD grades away. They're taking kindergarten 1, 2, 3 through 12 away. And the whole thing is an open system where the child proceeds at his own pace and has his own test. He's not being compared against anybody else, no competition. Because he is the cog in the wheel. He's being trained for the state and the corporations, not for his own upward mobility. Forget classical education. That's what they're putting in right now. They're calling it Reinventing Schools Coalition.
Way back, probably way before Plato, but he's very clear on it, and Aristotle's clear on it, and Hegel's clear on it. Self-knowledge is where it's at. Know what you're capable of, know what your boundaries are, and then your education comes in enlarging those boundaries. And as you do, you get freer and freer.
The condition of the average American right now, who has been conditioned by the television and in the schools and pretty much in daily life, you know, with the community councils and all, it goes away from the individual. Everything is to get, well, John Dewey said it, we have to get rid of the individualism. Everything goes towards the collective, the group. And ever since the early 60s or 50s, they've had the training sessions going on. They started in Bethel, Maine, National Training Labs, to use sensitivity training to bring people together in groups, and they'd all spill their guts about everything. And once you've done that, you're dependent on that person, right? Because they know everything about you. So this is the way you form the collective. It really is very interesting, the sensitivity training, how it works. And it says right in the original documents that it's Chinese communist thought control. Well, Americans have been exposed to this now, you know, certainly since World War II. And they've become little collectivists, really, groupies. They think that way. Anybody who thinks as an individual really is looked at askance, you know, strange person, you know, having an opinion that is opposite to what I've heard every night on the TV or in school or in college. Strange person, these individualists, huh?
The myriad components of collectivism combine to form a comprehensive system for transforming the individual into a cog within the machinery of the state. The first step is to remove self-reliance, thus creating dependence on the state or collective. The next step is to create a motivation based on fear of scarcity, as opposed to creativity and productivity. Remove the systems of autonomy, creativity, and self-teaching, which help create individuality in the first place, and the void is filled by the will of the collective. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the mind is no different.
It's the evolution of slavery, that's all it is. It's very, very simply done as well.
What's happening today is not just an elite making a final move to take over anything. Every generation for hundreds of years has been brought up with the same elite's predecessors, designing and running the show for each generation.
Since the dawn of time, small groups of human beings have instilled artificial circular limitations on the minds of their subjects through the procession of history. Traditionally, the limitations are imprinted on the servile population through a cunning use of language, instruction, and media for the purposes of conquest, social cohesion, and authoritative order by harnessing the human resources of the broad population. Human history reflects countless stories, regardless of what era you happen to live in, and the common thread throughout these stories is that of the struggle between the state, whatever its form, and the individual, the goal of which is to harness and subsume the individual, willingly or unwillingly, into its group collective.
The role of authority is a predatory system that sees the individual basically as a unit of energy.
Slavery has always existed in one form or another. There's different ways to have slavery. You can either get a bunch of henchmen, force a tribe into obeying you and being your slaves. That's a lot of force. But you have to feed them, etc. or you can allow them to keep so much of their earnings for themselves to maintain themselves and take off all the rest to supply the elite and the structure of the system over them.
In an attempt to assist the state, a 14th century Italian named Niccolò Machiavelli crafted several books intended to help the ruling elite dominate their subjects with the most effective psychological warfare techniques available to the world at that time.
And he was trying to convert the Medici family into hiring him to provide political advice. Conspiracy is the story of history. It's the story of plunderers taking care of people who produce. They claim to take care of them through government, which doesn't give you anything, it doesn't take away first. So it's not creating something out of nothing. It's very real what they're doing. They're taking your rights or taking some people's rights and adding more to someone else's rights.
Concurrent to Machiavelli's efforts, the consequences of tyranny were sowing the seeds of liberty throughout Europe, with authors like Etienne de la Boétie of France leading individuals to consider their situations and discover effective means to achieving liberty for all.
So this whole idea of Machiavelli telling the ruling elite how to do this in a more efficient and effective manner without people directly knowing about it. But his mistake is that these books get out there and other people start to read these books because it's not just the ruling elite. This starts to have an influence in Europe. You've got a character named Etienne de la Boétie who writes a discourse on voluntary servitude. And basically what de la Boétie does is he shows you that everything that Machiavelli told the ruling elite about how to control you is undone when you understand it to the nuts and bolts level, where you can then withdraw your consent, and that only then are you free.
Ever since the late 1800s, you started to see the royal class slowly moving away and basically getting rid of their power to govern. And there's a reason for this. It's because the elite of the world were in the process of changing the system. They realized that rule by monarchy has a finite life, and it was nearing its end towards the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s. Rule by royalty was pretty much done. So they realized this and wanted to change the system. People for the first time were standing up and demanding human rights. Well, you can't have human rights under rule by royalty, because under rule by royalty, you're a subject or a servant.
There are two types of control. One you can see, touch, and taste: communism, fascism, dictatorship like apartheid in South Africa. You know that you're in a dictatorship. That has a finite life, because when people know the situation they're in and they can see their controllers, then the desire for human freedom, it may take some time, but that desire will eventually overturn that control. The greatest form of control is dictatorship you cannot see, the prison without the bars, as I call it, with the facade of freedom and this farce called democracy, which is ludicrously connected to the word freedom when it is anything but. And this covert control leads people to sit in a prison cell thinking they're free because they can't see the bars, because they appear to be free, but appearance is all that it is.
Royalty started stepping back, government started stepping in, and then they started changing the system to a collectivist system.
So when you had this apparent explosion of freedom around the world, when the former colonies were given independence, what actually happened was dictatorship they could see was replaced by dictatorship they couldn't see, far more potent, far more effective.
Now, one of the earliest signs of people demanding their rights and government reflecting those rights in amendments would be the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. It says, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States." Now, most people think that's a pretty straightforward statement. They're getting rid of the black slavery. That might have been what they were doing, but it's not the entire intention. If you examine it, it actually has a double meaning. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist. Well, what that actually did was it turned voluntary servitude into a perfectly legal concept. Now, this is what the collectivist system is based on. Again, as people started demanding their rights, they realized that they had to take slavery or servitude that you could see and move it into a system where you can't see it. The average person wouldn't know they're a slave or a servant in servitude. But they did it in a way that is completely voluntary. All you have to do is scrutinize and examine the laws of your nation, whether it's driver's licenses, birth certificates, whatever it is, it's all 100% completely voluntary. Anywhere you see where you have to apply for something, that's a voluntary act. Applying for something is a voluntary act.
These 3 words is how the government has been getting authority over us. Registration, application, submission. All of the power they have over you is because you have put your signature on a document with 1 or 2 or 3 of these words. The word registration, what does it mean? I thought I just put my name down. Nuh-uh. Historically, it goes back hundreds and hundreds of years to an act of a ship's captain signing over his ship and all chattel contents to the harbor master for safekeeping. Chattel contents included the slaves, the condemned, those in debt, anything that could be party to a contract essentially was considered chattel property. Application. Oh, when I found this one out, I was like, oh my goodness, I'm telling. Application. Application means to beg. To beg, plead, petition, implore, entreat, or request. I was like, beg? I started looking at the assumptions. If you want to look at a word and figure out what this word, what effect this word is going to have on your life, you need more than just the definitions. You need to look at the assumptions that this definition rests upon, and then you need to look at the implications created. The assumptions created by begging. He who begs knows exactly what they're begging for. Well, mind you, one time in Toronto, I had a woman ask me, can I have anything? But for the most part, someone's begging, they know exactly what they're begging for. They know exactly what they are willing to give up for it. They are acknowledging the authority to grant. Or if it doesn't exist, they're willing to create it through transference. If you beg me to take your shoe off and scratch your toe for you, maybe then I would have the authority to do that. Prior to you begging me to take your shoe off, I try touching your property, you can kick me in the teeth. We transfer authority if that authority doesn't already exist when we apply. And finally, because you are a human being and no one's ever obliged to beg, it's an entirely voluntary action. You can never claim, oh, they made me apply. No one has ever made you apply for anything. Submission. Submission is their other tricky little definition. It means to agree to bend to another's will or to leave to another's discretion. If you are agreeing to bend to someone's will, you are in contract with them, and again, in order for it to be voluntary or lawful, it has to be voluntary. If you are agreeing to leave something to someone's discretion, in order for you to legally leave something, you must have possession and ownership of it. And again, you're abandoning it, and that's an entirely voluntary action. They get all their power when you put your signature, which is evidence of an oath, on a document with the words registration, application, submission. They do it with everything. You want to register your kids? What are you going to do? You're submitting an application for registration. You want to register your vehicle with the motor vehicle branch? You're submitting application for registration. You want to register your real property? Submitting application for registration every time.